name is Mildly Gothic, and I'm sitting on the floor in the corner of a room. But that's not what's important. What is important is what I'm going to show you today is the process of finishing one of the biggest paintings I have ever done. And I'm not a sports person, but it is an iconic sports moment. It is the helmet catch from, I believe, the 2008 Super Bowl. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1 and kind of want to see how I approached and laid out everything, you can go ahead and check out that video there. But what this is kind of the finishing touches, some of the thought processes for how I approach this, specifically anatomy, musculature, which is the same thing as anatomy, lighting, finishing touches, and just general thoughts on doing a painting in this style at this scale, because that's not something I've ever done before. So this is going to be a very chill video. If you have something else to do, go ahead and just have it on in the background and listen to me ramble. Thank you so much for clicking on this video, and without further ado, let's paint some football players! So if you didn't catch the last video, this might be a bit of a jump cut, but essentially I am working on the jersey of the Giants player, and it is a very wrinkly texture. There is a lot of motion in this overall image, and a lot of that is captured through the wrinkles of the clothing. And how do you really emphasize that is through the shadows. That's also because the style I ended up going with was far more realistic than I thought I was going to be trying to capture when I first took on this project. My friend and I talked about it, and he was like, yeah, just kind of something cartoony or color blocked, that'll be perfect. Except I'm a detail-oriented perfectionist, and I said, nah, I'm gonna make this really cool. And so I just spent a lot of time in all of the super fine details, and I think almost to some extent it leans into hyper-realism, just because of how dramatic I made some of those shadows. One of the key points of just defining anything is the shadows. Getting the darkest darks rich enough to truly convey the depth and the difference between the blackest black and the whitest white. You know, light sinks into those dark crevices, and making sure that you actually emphasize that difference enough is really important. And if this project taught me anything, it is that. It is that I should not be afraid of using black or really dark brown to kind of mix my colors and truly settle things into the depths. Because it isn't until you push things far back enough that you actually bring forward those other important elements. And capturing the shadows, it's not only the wrinkle on the shirt, but it's also the interaction between those two players, capturing how the Patriots' arm casts a shadow over the Giants' shirt, and how that not only changes the shirt color, but also the color of the number on the back of his jersey. That dark red that's already a crimson becomes much more of a brown, much more of that dark, rich tone. So lighting and playing with that was really, really important in this entire process. And the way you manage that is essentially, I tend to define a midtone or something that leans on the lighter side, and then add in some shadows, add in some more lightness, add in some more intense shadows, and then back to lightness.
So I had a realization, and I think I'm just stupid. That's his thumb. That's his hand. His hand is like this, but it's super, he's like trying to grab. And so there's weird, this is like foreshortened because his knuckles are like closer to you than his wrist or anything else is. So like these fingers look tiny, but they're also bent. His hand still looks a little weird. There's schmutz on it. That's his thumb. I don't know how I did not realize that before in the graininess of the photo, but I'm gonna update some of the shading on that. But yeah, this is just as I was painting and working on it, that's a thumb. It's definitely his thumb. And that whole thing, for some reason I thought like this was his thumb, like curved. No, that whole thing right there I think is his thumb. So I think it's a little too big, so I'll work on that. But yeah, man, proportions are hard.
On top of the shadows being a consistent problem for this project, the other one was the overall color tone. Because while a lot of this painting is white or gray, there's actually a lot of differences in the tones of those colors. So the jersey that this Giants player is wearing is a more cool toned white, versus when I looked at his pants, there was a little bit more of a gray in there. It wasn't quite as bright. And so in a lot of my shading, I was using warm tones or more like taupes to kind of try to add some of that depth into the shadows instead of just using black and white, which leads to a very, very cool toned approach. In contrast, I'll talk about later that that's exactly what I did for the Patriots pants, because his pants are super, super shiny gray, but the Giants player's pants are not. There's this kind of yellowy, and there's definitely some grass stains on them, but overall, accurately capturing the undertones of colors can make a big difference in visually how the whole thing comes together, especially if you're trying to replicate realism, because no two colors are almost, identical, which is another reason why you should, if you have a large area that is going to use a very specific color mixture, paint it all at the same time. Do not assume that you will be able to mix the same exact color twice. I promise you, you might be able to get really, really close, but it's not going to be exact. And I got burned by that a couple times. Again, with the Patriot player. We'll get to him. But for the most part, these pants were pretty easy. I was just fighting myself in these colors. I ended up doing 3 layers on the pants. I just kind of used that one white base layer to define the shape of where these pants were going to be. And then 1 layer of shading on top, where I was absolutely struggling with what the undertones of these actually should be and where some of those really, really dark things needed to go. Because half of what's casting the shadow onto this part of the painting isn't actually painted yet. It's the other Patriot player's leg. And so not having that representation made working on these legs really, really weird. But speaking of the other Patriot player, I approached him in basically the same way. I based it out entirely with just a plain white first. It just makes sure that I can get a more consistent and even color application on top. And once that base is dry, going on top of it with more of my darker colors. And as I'd said, these ones, this guy's pants, if you look at the photo, are a very, very bright silvery gray. And so I used absolutely nothing other than white and black when mixing my shadows to establish the color tones on this. It would mean that I got a much brighter, cool-toned gray. Now, black itself can have different undertones. I can check which one I'm using. I want to say it's Mars Black, but that is something to be aware of, is that even black can have undertones. So look at your paint. Different known pigments are known to kind of have different undertones. So if you need a specific undertone or color, make sure you pick up the right tube of paint. Painting the creases and stuff on the pants, this is where I think, honestly, I might have leaned into the shadows a little bit too much, because they're very soft in the image in some ways, but I painted them a little bit more aggressively than they necessarily needed to be, and I think it's just because I wanted them to be there. Another thing I painted far more aggressively than was probably visible is the musculature on these football players. Some of the only defined areas of shading on both of their legs is their musculature, and you could see it in the dip of the hamstring on the Giants player, and here it's kind of around the quad and I guess hamstring of the Patriots player. These are big muscly dudes, and part of making them look like football players is defining and accentuating that muscle. However, I do think I leaned into it a little bit too much and probably could have softened up some of my areas of shading, specifically around the legs and their muscles. But I do still think the final image is effective, and you can tell, what they are and what it's supposed to be, and it looks right. I think I am being a little overcritical, but at the same time, I do still think the shading might have been just a wee bit aggressive. So this jersey right here is exactly what I was talking about when I said that I was going to get myself in trouble when it came to mixing colors. The color of this jersey for the Patriots is a very dark but very saturated blue. It's not quite a navy, it has a little bit more characteristic to it, And one of the other weird things is the material that sports jerseys are made of reflect light differently. They're very shiny, and so those lighter tones tend to be a lot brighter than it might otherwise be. And I was having an absolute nightmare of a time trying to mix lighter shades of blue for this. Depending on if I added too much white, it went gray, but I couldn't add too much more of the base blue because then it wasn't in the right color family. It wasn't quite dark enough. So translating this shade of blue into lighter tones was really hard. It was very easy to make darker. I just added black. But to make it lighter and actually get those differences, it was really, really hard to keep it consistent. And so initially, I didn't actually worry about making it lighter than that mid-tone color. I just focused on where those heavy shadows were going to be, mostly under his arm, and kind of hoped that those heavy shadows would be enough contrast that I wouldn't have to worry about making lighter tones. I was wrong. You will see later that I did end up trying to lighten it to actually relative success. But that meant that I had to mix this blue color at least 3 different times, because I have the first time that I did the upper half of his body, the first time I'm doing this bottom bit here, and then the shading later. I actually did the shading for the upper half of his body at the exact same time that I did the base layer. It just, dried fast enough. But yeah, this blue gave me trouble. Here you can see a little bit better what I was talking about with how aggressively defined this man's hamstring is, and you can also see me not abiding by the principle of measure twice, cut once. I know this is painting, but essentially I drew guidelines for where the stripes on his leg were gonna go, and then just still basically freehanded it and decided that I was going to do something completely different because clearly I know better than myself a few minutes ago. One of the most important things with these guidelines, and the reason that I put all the detail into the pants first, is these lines are on the fabric. I'm painting them on top of what I'd already done beneath, but they are incorporated into the fabric, and so I needed to have an understanding of where all of those shadows sat so that I could appropriately wrinkle these stripes and then also shade them ever so slightly to capture those wrinkles and dimensions. I did also start with them relatively skinny and kind of slowly made them a little bit thicker. I was really worried about making them too thick at first and not having enough space between them, but I really, really wanted to make sure they actually looked like they were part of his clothing and were sitting where they were supposed to be on the pants and with the wrinkles. So while I started the red stripe from the knee up, I actually took the blue stripe from the top down. And part of this was to make sure that I got my spacing consistent, because I had a pretty good reference for how far apart they should be at the top. And I also wanted to make sure that it very accurately followed the flow of the red stripe and the pants, again with respect to all of those little folds and idiosyncrasies. Because that was the most complicated part, because as it gets over towards his butt, the wrinkles smooth out, and so they aren't the same for each line. They're actually a little bit softer. So it was kind of playing connect the dots, making sure the 2 points met at where they were supposed to, and that it was as straight and crisp as it could be. This line was entirely free-handed, and I'm actually quite impressed with myself for how crisp and smooth I was able to get it. By the time I got to the third line, I was a lot more confident in the spacing and how they were going to sit, and also had realized that my guidelines were absolutely useless. You can see where they are on his knee. The reason I didn't end up following them is I decided that they weren't shifted far enough forwards on his knee, and so I thought it was going to mess with the rotation of kind of where his hips and body were, because those lines are on the side of his pants and so kind of dictate the shape and turn of his leg. So I needed to make sure they were actually far enough forward so that the side of his body made sense. I went through and thickened up the lines because I realized I, 1, had the space to, and 2, visually should, and also went through and ever so subtly added shading into the depths of the valleys of the wrinkles. And that, I think, was the final touch to really make them look like they were sitting, that they were part of the pants and weren't just sitting stuck on top like a sticker. They were actually moving and creasing with the folds that I had already defined underneath. And I had originally been really worried that the crinkles that I put into this area of his pants were a little too aggressive and defined. I still think they are. I still think I did them way too sharp. But I do think that the lines on top kind of helped soften them a little bit and make them not as visually aggressive. I wish I could say that I had a good game plan going into defining the musculature for the legs. I didn't. I was entirely just working off the reference image and trying to define those areas of lightness and shadow, and got myself into a little bit of trouble with the pants of the Patriot player because of how shiny that material is. So the light areas are really, really bright, and the dark areas are actually surprisingly soft. So I needed to still show that darkness and the shadows, but also not, ruin the fabric and the texture of the pants, because these pants are so smooth and shiny. So I was just adding more lights, and then adding more darks, and then adding more lights and more darks. And the key to these pants was blending and really trying to make sure that I had soft, even transition areas between colors because these pants were so shiny. I do think I, again, ended up overemphasizing the musculature on the leg. I put a really, really bright shine, and I think while it tells you the muscle's there, I also think it was probably a little too much. The shadows around his belt were also just proving a little bit of a challenge because they aren't as well defined, and I don't know the anatomy or construction of football player pants, but it looked like his belt disappeared into his pants and there was only a little bit visible in front, and so that made it look weird. I felt like I was missing part of his belt. The pants wrinkled oddly, and I was struggling to see what was a shadow cast by the belt and or belt loops, and what were crinkles because of the way he was holding his leg. So this was a lot of back and forth and kind of trying to both make it look like the reference image and also just make it look as correct as it could be, because you need to know what you're looking at when you first look at it, and it needs to not stick out like a sore thumb. This is also where I ran into a little bit of issues with the shading, because this fabric is so shiny that there was kind of a weird shadow almost down this one part of his leg where you might think it should be a shine. Shiny fabrics get really, really weird, but it was definitely not doing me any favors. I decided to fill in the black between them at this point because I was struggling with their relationship to each other, and the Patriot dude was just looking a little anemic, and I couldn't tell if that's because his jersey needed to go over more or if he didn't look like he was correct in relationship to the Giants player. And part of that is the fact that this space between them is currently bright, where in the photo it is very, very much dark. I also realized when approaching this that I actually painted the Giants player jersey far too much into that center space between them, and so you'll see that I'm actually painting over some of the work that I had done there with the black paint because it just wasn't accurate to the photo. And then I also actually had to carry up the Patriot dude's jersey a little bit because I didn't actually carry that up enough for it to match the reference photo.
So I'm at a really interesting spot with this. I filled in, some of the black to see how it looks. I actually really like it. I have to work on a little bit of the belt and his stomach because that just stands out like a sore thumb. And then there's a little bit, I think this Patriot dude needs a little bit more work. And then I have to clean up a few little splotches on the helmet. But I'm really close to being done, and that feels really weird. Except I still have to decide what I want to do with his face or lack thereof. I really don't think I want to do a face because, that's been hard enough, let alone all of this sort of shading. I don't know that I really want to give him a face, but I think I do want to add some shading to the edges of the helmet to make it look like his face is inset into the helmet. There's also a few, nicks on his arm, but the skin color, I've been having a lot of issues with it here. I don't know that I want to redo the skin color. I do not think it's going to come out the same at all, so I might just leave that alone. But then I just have to do the whole whatever border I'm going to do, little background sort of a thing. And this thing is almost done, which feels crazy.
This footage is of me working on the shading and stuff more around some of those finer details on the belt, but I also just want to point out in the upper left-hand corner, you can see that the logo on his chest is done. There's a lot of finer details of this that I just didn't finish, whether it was because my face was right up on top of the painting and I knew I wasn't going to be able to get good footage of it, or I was really concerned about the way that it was going to come out. There's some of the details of this where it's so new and scary, and yeah, I'm filming it, but at the same time, and I know no one's actively watching me while I do it, but there's almost enough pressure of the camera just being there that it makes me anxious for the work that I'm doing and what I'm putting into it, and I would rather share it after the fact than film the process of me doing it. Some parts I was very confident in, other parts I was not, like some of the finer details on the shirt. It was more of an angle thing. But man, a lot of the finer shading, I haven't shown, the Giants player got another layer of shading before I did the stripes to finish out his pants. I didn't film that because I was having a hard time getting it to look right. A great example of the point that I was making is the fact that this footage does not include me shading his belly. Wow, did I struggle with that. You'll see it in the next clip, and I don't remember if that's the final state or if I shaded it a little bit more. But this was so weird, making it not look like muddy or diseased. Used too much black and it didn't look like human skin. Used too much brown and it, or the wrong tone of brown, because it was really hard to match some of these subtle shadows. And it didn't look like skin. It almost, looked like a wound or something. So I was trying to darken it enough to put it under the shirt, but keep it light enough that you could still tell what it was supposed to be. I got there in the end, but man, if this was not a struggle.
So here's a me thinking out loud portion. Because I've done the black in there, I'm looking at it more. I do think I need to bring in a little bit more of the lightness that I did in the top part of the jersey into the bottom. I was originally ignoring it because it's the bottom part of the jersey. It doesn't really matter. However, I don't feel like that separation between them is well defined and you really can't see what's going on. And there is some weird wrinkly stuff. I don't want to make it as intense as like that guy's because it isn't as visible because it is so dark. But I really just want to highlight a couple of those like crinkles and stuff on the side to just bring a little bit more. I feel like this section looks unfinished next to this, and especially compared to the top part of his jersey there. Really think the belt has come along really nicely. I don't think I'm really going to do anything else there. I just think he needs a little bit better definition. So in the same vein, I kind of like shadowed where his knee was, but I need to do the same kind of light gray wash on the outside of the black because I'm going to do this like black fuzzy border around them. So I need there to be a separation between the black there and here. And so with that as well, his shoulder, there's some good highlights there. There's some decent highlights there. And that shoulder needs a little bit of a highlight so that doesn't get lost. I might have to kind of evaluate that as well with the area surrounding the Giants helmet. I have to think it out a little bit, but I was debating between black or another color. And I ended up on black because white is doing a white border. I feel like wouldn't make them stand out as much because there's so much white in the painting. I thought a black border would really accent this guy nicely. And I've been told by my friend he's not the important one. So I think it's kind of okay if a little bit of his jersey blends in a little bit. However, I do think I'll go in and probably make sure the edges of him are highlighted at least somewhat so that the black, because like that doesn't really stand out. So I want to make sure that issue doesn't happen over there. So that's kind of the plan because I wanted something to make them pop out, I guess, more than they are on this background. So there's kind of my word rambles. So I just need to make sure I don't lose his kneecap or his jersey, and I'm already losing his jersey a little bit. And then I have to make sure I don't accidentally paint over anything that I've already done because that would eat me alive inside. So anyways, it's fine, but that's me just kind of thinking through and processing what I need to do next because I'm almost scared to touch it now because I'm in the home stretch. So yeah, this is becoming a little nerve-wracking.
I started the border of black by just going all the way around the painting and giving it a relatively thick line. I didn't want it to be thin because for the next step, I wanted to give myself as much of a buffer
between my chaos of the sponge and what I was trying to do with the border and the actual painting itself. So I used this brush that I think is about a centimeter, wide, and essentially that was my minimum distance, and then feathered that out a little bit more. So I think all in all, it ended up being about an inch of black paint from the edge of the football players to just the gray on the rest of the board. Now, my slightly unhinged way that I decided to approach feathering this out was, again, my trusty ripped up car sponge, which has made an appearance in at least 3 different... This will be the 3rd video. If you haven't seen my mural that I did last year, you can go check out that. I used my car sponges for feathering and texture, and then I also used it on the atmosphere for the earth of one of the other parts of this commission. This is one of 3 pieces for this whole commission, but I was trying to feather it out, and this did not go entirely well. I think part of why is because it was just black paint. There wasn't any of the other color to kind of make a nice ombre. I do not film it, and I do not have footage of it. The way that I ended up finishing out the border to this was taking some of the gray paint that I had as the background and doing a large ombre kind of from the black paint, slowly mixing in more and more gray paint and feathering that out. It almost gave it kind of like a motion blur effect. I was almost going for like an opposite vignette, like the vignette filters you can put on Instagram where it's like dark at the edges and lighter inside. Going for the opposite, dark at the center behind them, fading out to the lightness. So the end result was not achieved using this sponge. It was achieved using a large paintbrush and both the gray and the black paint. So it's been a minute since I've gotten to work on this piece, and so I will explain kind of what I think is going to happen next. As you can see, I was working on the black outline there, and that needs to be fuzzed out a little bit more. So that needs to happen all the way around. I think I'm going to add what's called a face, like visor or shield to his helmet. Basically, it will make it reasonable why he has no face, because I'm not giving him a face. And then for these dark areas, I'm not as worried about the center, because that, is just there. But you see how, there's a good highlight at the top there? I want to capture that along the outside edge so that his jersey is more defined and visible from the black border. I'm also going to have to clean up the helmet cage over there and add a little bit of an extra shine on the front there for the exact same reason. That's why I went with black. So much of this painting is light, but I still want to make sure for the parts that aren't that I get enough contrast that they're nice and visible. So jump scare to him having a face. The reason I decided to paint an actual face instead of going with the visor is it almost felt more intimidating to do the visor because it wasn't in the reference image. Visors and of that sort are reflective and shiny. What were those reflections going to be? Where did it sit on his face? Was I going to have to see his face behind the visor? It felt like too many unknowns compared to just actually giving him a face. This was also a challenge doing with the face guard already in place. I should have just painted his face before I did the face guard. But no, I decided to make my life more complicated, and so I didn't. I saved his eyes for last because eyes are the window to the soul, and I wanted to kind of get all of the other elements of his face kind of in place before I went ahead and did his eyes. If you'll notice here, he doesn't have teeth. I decided to just kind of do it as a block. I was hoping it would kind of look like just a mouth guard. And once I kind of had his eyes in place, I was just touching up some of the finer details on his face. This, more than any other part of this painting, felt like sculpting with paint and with light. Because I just needed to kind of give suggestions of where the raised parts of his face were and where the further back ones were. Like putting that shadow across the top of the head immediately made his face look like it was within the helmet. Putting those shadows from the bars across his face made it look like it was behind this mask. And that's really what painting comes down to, and why lighting is so incredibly important to understand, is it really helps you understand the shape of things. It is how you process and understand the relative size and shape of things in the world. And especially humans are really good at identifying faces, which is also why I was so concerned about his face not looking right. But in the end, I think the final result is pretty good, and I'm really happy that I decided to do a face and not just do the visor. Well, this one is done.
It is about to go off to its home. All I have to do is sign it and erase. There's still a pencil mark up there. But yeah, some final things: fixed the shading over there, added whatever the hell those are on top of the little visor. He's got a face now. I think that looks pretty good. Here's a look at everything else. I think I'm gonna put my signature just in the top of his knee right there, because obviously I can't sign on the black. But yeah, this one has been insane. And honestly, I was really scared of how it was gonna turn out. So yeah, the hard one is done. Now I gotta go paint a stadium. I thought that was gonna be the one I did first and the easy one. That one's proving to be a nightmare so far. But here is the helmet catch. The first time I have ever painted really people at this detail in this scale. So this just feels kind of surreal, and now I get to go hand it off.
Thank you so much for sticking with me to this point in the video. I know this is a little bit of a different one because it's just watching me paint a board, the same board, for a while, and there's only so much that can be said about it, but I truly hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.